Lunch and Learn. Oh, I think we're up. Sorry, we tried a new screen there. I don't know if you caught me, but good morning or good afternoon again to our Lunch and Learn. I am Tony DiUlio. I'm one of the owners and partners at Wheeler, DiUlio, and Barnaby. As you're probably aware, since you're here, we are doing our Perfect Claim series. We are on part 4 today, where we are going to talk about understanding and reviewing insurance policies. Of the entire series, this might be the most important that we go over because it is one of the areas that I actually find to be extremely lacking when it comes to actual understanding of insurance policies, what they're actually saying, what they mean, and there can be a lot of value to truly understanding what an insurance policy says and how it acts for a specific loss. We have a really good turnout, at least in registration. I know not everyone is always able to make it live, but as always with this live Lunch and Learn, if you have any questions through this process, please let us know. When it comes to an understanding a policy, these things are not easy to understand. Insurance policies aren't written in a way that anyone can understand it. So if you've got questions, experiences that you need some extra insight on, anything that we could offer to help, please write it into the chat. As always, behind the scenes is my partner, Mario Barnaby, who's able to respond live in chat. And if there are questions that we can address for the group, we'll upload them to the PowerPoint and have them presented for everybody to gain some information. The purpose of this entire series and all of the Lunch and Learns has always been the same. My goal is that you don't have to give me a call. I really don't want cases to have to go to litigation because it just means that it takes longer for an insured, it takes longer for them to get paid and their property ultimately to be repaired. So with the Lunch and Learn series, we're really trying to just get information out to the masses so that we can have a proper adjustment of a claim and a proper payment by the insurance company. Of course, if anything does go south, please feel free to ask for any help that I can be. I would be happy to provide it. At this point, I'm working in states all across the country, so if there's anything I can do, please let me know. So without further ado, let's jump into this because this is a lot in this topic. Understanding an insurance policy is complex. They are long, they're wordy. So if this goes a little over an hour, I apologize. I will do my best. As I always have in all of these, in this series, is our disclaimer. Not every claim is perfect. In fact, most claims aren't perfect. Just because something doesn't go perfectly or a step isn't taken doesn't mean that the claim isn't covered, doesn't mean that it should be denied or that there's any liability as a result. This is simply a guide as to what could and should be done, but not what has to be done. So please be noting that accordingly. All right. If you missed it, last month we did part 3 of the Lunch and Learn series where we talked about the first impressions and first inspections, how important those are for the advancement of a claim, what you should be doing at your first inspection so that you're maximizing your time while you're out at the property so that you maximize the profitability of every claim that you're on so you're not consistently going back having to do more. We also went over, very importantly, the first inspection checklist. The checklist, I think, is a great tool for adjusters to use when they go out to their property. If you didn't get a copy of it for some reason, please send me an email. I will be happy to get you a copy. The email was on the first slide, but it's also on the last one if you need it. Or, of course, you can go to our website. So let's jump into what we're going to go over today. We're going to talk about a few main things. And first and foremost is going to be how to read an insurance policy. Just going through really some basic information of a policy, but what I recognize a lot of adjusters never learned when they were learning the trade of adjusting. The insurance policies have a lot of formulas and how they're put together, so we're going to go through that. We're going to talk about understanding an insurance policy. Now, I recognize that sounds very similar to reading it, but they're very, very different. Understanding how a policy works, how it's put together, and how the coverages and the exclusions and the additional coverages and the conditions, how all of that works together is really important when it comes to determining whether or not a loss is covered. Finally, we're going to look at some real life examples of policies and looking at how they are different and tricks to the policy interpretation that'll help you in the field for, again, real life examples. So there's a lot to review for today. We're going to go through what is the deck page, what is a full policy. I mean, these questions come up constantly with adjusters, and it's extremely frustrating. what the renewal package is, Section 1 versus Section 2 coverage, additional coverages, the normal coverages, exclusions, HO versus BOP versus CP policies, and much, much more. This is something I put in here because I wanted people to really understand a little bit of the background. In 1993, the NAIC put together a guideline for understanding insurance policies and an act that says insurance policies must be able to be easily read by whoever they're sending it to. You know, in essence, avoid the big words, avoid complicated language, and that type of stuff. Also, part of that is what is known as the Flesch scale. In essence, how easy it is to read something. Bible, by the way, the higher the number, the easier it is to read. So 100 would be equivalent to, you know, a preschooler's book. The Bible is rated a 66.97. Einstein's theory of relativity, 17.72. Remember, the closer to 1, the harder it is to read. The average insurance policy is a 10.31 on the Flesch scale. That just gives you a sense of how difficult these things truly are to understand. And despite the NAIC's effort to step in and say these things need to be more legible and readable, the fact is they're not. Some carriers have tried, and the ones that have tried have failed, in my personal opinion, because they're doing one of two things. They're either overcomplicating it, or in their process of trying to fix it, they're taking coverage away for their own benefit and not the benefit of their insureds. So, size matters, everybody. I hate to break it to you, but it's true. And the reason I put this slide in here is because of a personal frustration. I ask adjusters constantly, not about size mattering, by the way. I see Mario laughing behind. Not that frustration. But for when it comes to the policy, sorry there. When it comes to the policy, I have a personal frustration because I work with adjusters constantly. And I tell the adjusters, hey, do you have a copy of the policy? Can you send it over? Sure, absolutely, no problem. And they send me usually somewhere between 9 and 15 pages. And I say, thank you very much, but this is not the full policy. So I'd be curious, if you throw it into the chat, feel free to play along, but certainly think to yourself how long you think the average homeowner's policy is. Well, I went through it. I went through the top 14 carriers in the area and made an average for what they are. And that number, 70 pages. The average homeowner's policy is 70 pages long. So when you ask for a copy of the policy from the insured and you're getting 9, 10 pages, that is not the full policy. We're going to talk about how you can know that when you're looking through the policy. So there are a few different policy types when it comes to homeowners. Now remember, there are the standard homeowners policies what I shouldn't say homeowners, residential properties, and then you've got commercial and business properties. The BOP policies and the CP policies, they're their own beast. They are piecemeal put together for individual clients. There is some level of formula to them, but not much. So most of this presentation is going to be focused on homeowners for the sole purpose that they are far more uniform in how they work, even though they are all extremely unique in how they are written. So going through this, I want you to ask yourself before I hit the list, who knows what each one of these 6 HO policies are? If you do, great. And if you don't, you should write this down because this is very important when you are reviewing losses to know what you're getting yourself into. HO1, it's your basic named peril policy, right? Named perils are going to have, your fire is going to be included in almost all of them. And then if you get extended coverage for named perils, you get other things like windstorm and vandalism and those types of losses. But the named peril policies are important because you're only getting coverage for those named perils. It's a lot more limiting. The HO policy is also for structure only. There's no contents involved, and there's also no liability coverage. So it doesn't cover the accident that occurs on the property if someone were to slip and fall. HO2 is a named peril with structures, contents, and has liability coverage. So your structure and contents will be the same named perils, but there's also going to be an added component for liability. HO3, probably the most popular one out there. This is your all-risk coverage for structures, but it gives you named peril coverage for contents. That's important to remember that distinction because depending on the cause of the loss, you might have a very realistic situation where the structure is covered, but the contents are not. The other important aspect with HO3 coverage, the courts have come down in a number of states and said that you can't have less coverage with the all risk portion than you would have in the named perils. In essence, it's understood in the industry that the all risk language of the HO3 should be more encompassing than the named peril portion of the policy. What happened in a few cases is the carriers had coverage for contents under named peril, but then had an exclusion they were trying to enforce on the all risk language. It was ambiguous, but they were trying to push it anyway. The court came back and said that's crazy. You can't be covered under named perils and not be covered under all risk. So make sure you're looking at that when you're looking at the policies as well. So HO4, this is your standard renter's policy. This is almost always going to cover just contents on the home. So it's someone who is a tenant of a property. They cover their contents, but none of the structure involved. HO5, all risk on structure and contents. This is the Cadillac coverage, right? You've got all risk on both contents and structure, so you don't have to worry about any named perils when it comes to the HO5 policy. HO6 is the bane of my existence. I somewhat joke about that, but truthfully, I just dislike condo claims. It is a condo policy, covers personal property and the betterments and improvements. Condo claims can always be difficult because you've got a balance between the condo's master policy and the HO6 policy for the unit owner, how those interplay, what's covered under which. It just gets messy and often can cause trouble. They can be very, very profitable, though, for you in the field if you've got a loss at a condo and you get both the association and the property owner for multiple units. You can see how that would obviously be a large claim. So if you're ever looking, hey, what's a good way to get some larger losses? Start talking to people on condo boards, and you could expand your business accordingly. So here's a good question that I've asked at a number of events, and often get some correct answers, but I'm surprised how few know this. Which two carriers have the same HO3 policy? Now, if you think you have the answer, I offer you to put it into the chat as well. We're thinking about starting to use the chat just to create some back and forth to give away some prizes. So we're going to see if a prize were to be given on this. Let's see how many people can come up with it. We've got some nice swag that we can send out to any of the adjusters on this call, or contractors for that matter, as to which two carriers have the same HO3 policy. All right, that's probably enough time. I've rambled on long enough. I'll give you the answer. It's actually a very easy. None. There are no two carriers with the identical policy. It doesn't exist. I don't care if you're using the ISO form or not. You don't have the same policy because there are other issues within the declarations and a number of other things. No two carriers are the same. So when you're reviewing these policies, I'm going to stress this 20 times today. You have to read the policy because they aren't the same. Just seeing that they've got the Allstate all risk policy doesn't mean they're going to be the same as the State Farm policy. And candidly, it doesn't even mean they're going to be the same as the next door neighbor who also has Allstate, because they might have a different form and it might have different coverages. I have seen people who still have forms in place from the 80s. If you haven't seen what a policy looks like from the 80s, it is completely different when it comes to how it's worded and the coverages afforded. So really, I can't stress this enough. Read the policy. Okay, the declaration pages. Oh, I don't know why that was in there twice. This is your index to the policy. I put this image here. This is not an error. I use this on purpose because to a lot of people, I feel like they think it's just gibberish in the deck pages and they don't need to worry about it. They skip on forward. That couldn't be further from the truth. The deck pages are critical to your analysis of the policy and the claim, and I want to talk to you about why. There is really important information in the declarations. All of these things that we're going to talk about are issues that I look at on every single policy that I review. First and foremost, it gives you the named insureds. That comes up constantly because you need to know, who are you representing for the claim? Do I have the right person signed up for this? Right? A lot of times you're going to find that you're talking maybe to a son or a daughter of someone that might be elderly, but it's actually the elderly person who has the policy on the property. That's the person you need to be signing up. In addition, you need to know who has rights to the claim, right? What contents claims can I make under the policy? Who's going to have to be on the checks that are issued? These are critical issues when you are adjusting a loss. The mailing address and the insured address. These two aspects I use all the time whenever someone calls me and says, I've got a claim where it was denied because of residency. And what I mean by that is it was denied because the person lives at a second home for the majority of their time and spends little to no time at the other property that maybe a son or daughter lives at, or they're now renting out. The mailing address helps a lot because if the mailing address is different than the insured address, that means one very important thing, that the insurance company had noticed that the person wasn't there. I'm going to repeat that because it bears repeating. If the mailing address is different than the insured address, it means the carrier had noticed that the insured was not at the property. So whenever you have issues that come up about residency or occupancy of the property, you can use that information to help. Obviously, it's important what the limits are in the declarations page. It's probably the one thing that everybody on this call already looks at. The number one thing missed by most people on this conference right now are the forms involved in the policy. Understanding what the forms are, what they mean, how they play with the policy, all of it. We're going to talk extensively about the forms. Number 6 is potentially conflicting information. Reading the deck page, we had a case recently with a carrier who had a summary of coverages in the deck page. And what that summary went through is it said, this is what you're covered for in one column, and this is what you're not covered for in the other column. The problem is that chart didn't have any caveats to it. It didn't have any provisos regarding looking at the policy. So the deck page just said that they're covered for water damage. And then in the policy, they had a number of exclusions, as most do for certain types of water coverage. But we were to argue and settle the case with the insurance company saying that, look, what you're sending to the client for the deck page is not accurate. It's a misrepresentation and it's deceptive, which makes it a violation of the Unfair Trade Practices and Consumer Protection Law. So let's get this case settled, and they did. Obviously, the deductible is also in there. You're going to need to know what the deductible is to make sure that the carrier is calculating it appropriately, especially with so many shifts that have been happening to percentage deductibles in the industry and vanishing deductibles in some policies, which is also nice. So make sure that you review that so that your client isn't getting the maximum value on their claim. Note, if you ever see a percentage deductible in the claim, I would recommend talking to the insured about that and why that is a bad idea. Percentage deductibles to most homeowners don't mean what they actually are. Most homeowners, I find, when they hear a percentage deductible and they see that the deductible is 1%, they think that it's 1% of the loss. That's not true. It's 1% in most policies. It's a percentage of the policy limits. So that if you've got a 1% deductible on a $500,000 home, you've got a $5,000 deductible, even if your loss is only $6,000. So you can see how that is extremely confusing to a lot of homeowners, and you should have that conversation with them and perhaps advise them to switch carriers as a result. So let's dive into this. The forms on a policy and in the deck page are critical to your analysis. They provide me all of the information I need to know what is inside of this policy. There's 2 examples here of the forms. I know these are too small to read, so I got fancy. Taking a look on this side, this is from the farmer's policy. And there's a section here called Policy and Endorsements. And it gives a little paragraph from proviso and then a list of numbers and letters that look like gibberish to most people. Well, these numbers and letters are very important because it tells me what forms are supposed to be in this policy. These form numbers are going to match up with the documents within the policy itself. The pages within the policy will have these numbers on the bottom, and you can confirm, all right, here's 56-5648 first edition, found it in the policy, we're good, and go through to make sure you have everything. Farmers does this very specifically because outlining it like this makes it impossible to know what these forms are without going into the policy and actually checking. I believe that's on purpose, and I believe it's done to make sure that homeowners don't know what they're getting. But if you don't have these numbers and you can't compare them to the forms, you'll never know what the policy actually covers. Taking a look at another example from USAA, they do it a lot better in my opinion. They give you the form number and they give you the title of the form. Having the title of the form is extremely valuable because it gives you a quick reference to certain areas that you might need. So again, we can take a look. It has the same, what people think are just gibberish numbers, but with the actual title here, we know where to go. So we know that the HO 208-0712 is the water backup and sump pump overflow endorsement compared to the policy endorsements for farmers. I have no idea off the top of my head what J7023 first edition is. Not a clue, right? So I really like the way USAA does it. It makes it much simpler for us. Now, these numbers, they do actually mean something. So let's take a look. In most policies traditionally, and this is changing and the farmers is a perfect example, but most of the numbers are laid out like this for a policy form. The L's represent the line of insurance. The HO, for example, is your homeowner's policy. If you have a commercial policy, it will say CP. If you've got a business policy, it'll say BP or BOP, and we'll have the numbers accordingly. The numbers are the form number and type. So these are specific to the whether it be a basic form or a special form coverage. These numbers will be unique to that specific form. Finally, the last two numbers are the month and the year, so that we know that this form was from 2012 or 2008 or 2019. If we take a look, I told you before that those form numbers will be found within the document itself. So this, again, I think this was USAA, although I don't remember off the top of my head. On the first page on the declarations, we had the form number. I'm going to go back just so you can see it again. Right, we have the form number. I think it's this one that we're looking at. HO-9R02-0708. Or at least one of those HOs, and then we go into the policy itself, and we have the form number at the bottom of the page right here. Now, by doing this, by seeing this breakdown, you can know I've got all the necessary forms that are with the policy. So why is this so important? I have caught multiple times in policies that have been sent over that it has the wrong forms. I've actually had cases where the carrier forgot to include forms that they thought were supposed to be in the deck page that weren't. And the carrier is on the hook because they, even though they thought that the forms were in there, they weren't actually listed, they weren't part of the policy, and thus the exclusions included didn't apply. So you can go through and know, do I really have the full policy by double checking this information? It makes a huge difference because a lot of the endorsements you're going to see are things that can add coverage in and add benefits. Let me give you a perfect example. In Pennsylvania, I'm going back, Pennsylvania has a required endorsement that is on all policies. And that endorsement talks about the right of an innocent insured in the event of a loss to their property. Specifically, if you have a situation of abuse where someone is causing abuse to you, and they do something like try to burn the house down to cause you harm, whether it be physical, emotional, or otherwise, that is covered for the innocent insured. The person who was being abused and who didn't set the fire had nothing to do with it. They aren't held accountable because of this special endorsement in Pennsylvania. If you don't see the form list and don't know that that's in there, you're not going to recognize that there could be coverage for that without looking at those endorsements. I can't stress enough how important it is to get all of those. So moving forward now with these, this is really important. The renewal package is rarely, and I mean rarely, the full policy. People often send me a renewal package when I ask for the policy. This is the 9, 10, 15 pages that I get when I ask for a policy. But that's not the policy. It is simply a renewal package that outlines changes that have occurred and the forms that are in the regular policy without sending me the policy itself. Now, on the plus side, once you understand this, you can actually find a lot of the forms online if you know what you're looking for. So going back to that previous page, if I were to go into Google and type this search in for these numbers, there's a good chance that I'm actually going to be able to pull up this specific policy form for a homeowner. I want to stress this again. If you need to find a policy because the carrier is not sending it to you, look and search for the policy form numbers on Google. This is your best shot at finding the forms without the carrier sending them to you. And if you were to find this form and can confirm that it has the same number on the bottom, you can know with a very high level of certainty that this is the form as part of the policy, as long as it's what's listed in the deck page. Right? It's not enough to just look up USAA homeowners 3 form or homeowners policy. Those things don't bring up the proper form. This will. So if you have trouble finding a policy, search for these form numbers. All right. HO policies have general layouts that most carriers follow. Some of them change it. Chubb has some differences in theirs, and a few other carriers, but most of them will follow this generic outline. You will have your table of contents, section for your agreements, the definitions of the policy, the property coverages for section 1, which is really what you're going to care the most about, where it's your covered areas of loss, property not covered, additional coverages, losses insured, and losses not insured. Section 5 is going to be loss settlements. Section 6 is your conditions, and section number 7 is section 2 for all the liability coverages. This outline is, again, generally going to be accurate, and how all of this plays together is really the important part of insurance policies. Now, for those who don't know, most insurance policies are pretty much a flow chart, right? You start at one point and it tells you, you're covered unless you're excluded. Okay, so let's find out. I've got my direct physical loss. Now I have to go to my exclusions. So I look through my exclusions and it says these things are excluded unless they're specifically covered. Okay, so then I have to go back and look and do additional coverages and see if they're specifically covered there, or perhaps in the named peril section. It's really just a flow of a case, a flow of a claim in determining whether or not there is coverage. Most of these sections will interplay with each other, but all of them are important. One of the number one areas that I see adjusters missing are the definitions section. The definitions are really critical to understanding a policy because they are going to define words that the carrier feels are important under the policy. But what's really important about the definitions is actually not what is there, but what isn't there. Words that aren't defined by the policy leave open some level of interpretation. So if there is some kind of ambiguity that is created because it's not a defined word in the policy, then that ambiguity has to be read in favor of the insured and will ultimately, or should, lead to coverage. So make sure that you know to use the definition section, not just for what is there, but to point out to the carrier what's not defined. Defined words, for those who don't know, will generally be in bold, italics, or quoted. One of those three things will be true in almost every policy for a defined term. So you'll know that it's defined when in the policy itself, it's either bolded, quoted, or italicized. All right, words matter. Every policy is different. I don't know if I've stressed it enough, but they are. And because of that, you should read the policy. These are all samples of additional coverage and the start of the section for Allstate, State Farm, and Nationwide. Now, these three sections are all for additional coverage. We all know the additional coverage sections, but all three of these create different levels of responsibility and liability to the carrier, and all three of them change how the policy works together. So let's take a look at the first one here. The following additional coverages are subject to all the terms, provisions, exclusions, and conditions of this policy. Okay, very all-inclusive, right? In essence, anything in additional coverages is still controlled by the rest of the policy. This section just says Section 1 additional protection. There is no caveat coverage. There is nothing in here saying that everything else applies or anything applies. It is its own standalone section. That's really important because in here, that means you don't have to worry about the exclusions for the additional coverages. They can't apply because there's nothing that ties that flow chart together, right? There's nothing that says, hey, in the event of additional coverage, you still have to go back and check exclusions. This one down here, these additional property coverages are subject to the policy deductible, except as noted. In no event will the deductible be applied more than once to any one loss. Well, this is great. This clarifies the deductible issue, and you're not going to get hit twice, but it specifically doesn't mention the things that are mentioned here, right? It doesn't say that the exclusions apply to these additional coverages either. And this one actually might be the best of them all because I've used this provision to say, well, court, hold on a second. This carrier recognizes that there need to be special carve outs for additional coverage, right? They recognize that there's some unique situations that apply with additional coverage, and they note that. So if they wanted to note that exclusions applied, this carrier, most of all, knew they should have written it in here separately because they recognize this is an entirely separate section of coverage. That can make a big difference in the amounts that are paid on claims. All right, so some tricks of policy interpretation. Have I mentioned that all policies are different, so you should read them? I can't stress it enough. Read the policy. I'm going to, hopefully when this is done, you're going to understand why that's so important. You also have to look at the policy as a whole. When I started my career here and I started learning about policies, I used to do what I imagine most of you do. I would take a look at the policy, I'd say, great, I flip right to coverages, right? And I go right to that first paragraph and I want to find out, is this an all-risk policy or a named peril policy? And I read that section that says, we cover accidental direct physical loss unless it's excluded in the policy. Great, I've got all risk coverage. Now I just have to look to the exclusions and see if there's a reason this loss is excluded. That's not the right way to do this. You need to look through the entirety of the policy. And I know that feels daunting, but I promise the more you do this, it's quick. I can get through one of these policies in 5 minutes now because I know I've read enough of them to know the areas that I need to look at and the areas that I've already read. It's, by no means a daunting task anymore. So let's look at some examples to show you why this is so important. This is the Allstate policy and one of their conditions under the policy that I can nearly guarantee nobody knew about. And I'd like an honest response. If anybody on this call knew about this provision, please let me know. I really want to see it in the chat because this provision is really important. What Allstate says and gives you permission, specifically granting it to you. The residence premises may be vacant or unoccupied for any length of time, except where a time limit is indicated in this policy. A building structure under construction is not considered vacant. That is very, very important when you are dealing with a property that has a loss that is unoccupied or vacant. Because what you now have is written permission from the carrier to say that that property can be vacant and unoccupied. In the eyes of the law, just to be clear, vacant generally is going to mean that there's just no stuff in the property. You've got an empty unit. Unoccupied, there's no one living at the property. There are some disputes that carriers have tried of, oh, well, it was unoccupied while you were away at the mall for 3 hours. That's not true. It simply just can't be a lived-in property. So if they are giving permission for a property to be vacant or unoccupied, except unless it's limited in the policy, which is generally going to be your frozen pipe claims and your vandalism or theft claims, any other type of loss, trying to deny it because it was vacant or unoccupied, it's going to be nearly impossible for them. Nothing's ever impossible, unfortunately, in the law, but they're going to have a very hard time. So you've got a house. Person lived there for 3 years. They decide to buy another home. They keep this one, and it sits vacant for 8 months after they move to a different property. They have been given permission to leave the property vacant. If it is vacant, it can't possibly be a residence premises, but they're giving permission to do it, so great, I left it vacant. A loss occurs and they tried to deny it because the homeowner wasn't living at the property and it's not the residence premises, at least arguably not the residence premises anymore. Oh, I'm sorry. You gave me permission not to be there. You told me in writing it was okay that I leave that property vacant. As a result, that creates at minimum an ambiguity in the policy between residence premises and this provision. You've got coverage. Now imagine finding language like this in other policies that you're handling losses on, whether it be vacancy or some other issue. There's no scenario where I could spend enough time in lunch and learn, or really in any one setting, and go through every single policy and talk about every single special aspect to it. But as an adjuster, you should be looking at these policies to make these determinations. Here's a lot of questions I got on anti-concurrent causation. There was more than I could actually count off the top of my head this week regarding anti-concurrent. So I want to go through this a few times because it is, in my opinion, the dumbest language in an insurance policy because it just doesn't make sense with the rest of the policy. So let's talk about it. I think I've got 3 examples here so that you can see how this interplays within the policy and how it plays on a loss. So this is Allstate's language, right? Under coverage A and B, we do not cover any loss which consists of, is caused by, or would not have occurred but for one or more of the following excluded events. It's excluded regardless of the cause or source of the covered event, peril, or condition. Any other causes contributing concurrently or in any sequence with the excluded event, peril, or condition, and whether the excluded event, peril, or condition involves isolated or widespread damage, blah, blah, blah. In essence, if you've got any aspect of your claim before, during, or after that's excluded, Allstate says you're not covered here. Except this. They have this language also in the same section of their policy. That was section letter A. This is C. When loss is not excluded under paragraph A or B of losses we do not cover, and there are 2 or more causes of loss to the covered property, we do not cover the loss if the predominant cause of loss is or are excluded under paragraph D immediately below. What? It's nonsense. So what they come down and say, in essence, and this is one of 2 sections, by the way, of the Allstate policy. I'm only giving one example, but there's another ensuing loss provision. In essence, if you've got 2 causes of loss, and one of them is excluded and one of them is not excluded, and the predominant cause of loss is the not excluded issue, then you've got coverage. That's, in essence, how this plays out. And it's horribly written. It doesn't make any sense, because if you have this scenario, then you've got a loss that consists of something that's excluded. None of it makes sense. But you can use this ensuing loss coverage or this concurrent causation language in Allstate's policy to make sure that you get coverage, even if part of it is excluded. Almost every policy out there has something like this. So let's take a look at State Farm's. We will not pay for any loss to property described in A that consists of or is directly and immediately caused by one or more of the following perils, regardless of whether the loss occurs abruptly or gradually, involves isolated or widespread damage, blah, blah, blah. They've got this. However, we will pay for any resulting loss from items A through L, unless the resulting loss is itself a loss not insured as described in this section. So, real world example, the easiest example for all of these provisions. You've got a plumbing line in the house that's old and ultimately breaks. It's wear and tear to the pipe. Everyone knows the pipe's not covered in that scenario. But the ensuing water damage is covered in almost every policy. So that ensuing water damage is covered because of this ensuing loss provision. Despite the fact that the carriers have language before it that says, oh, I'm sorry, it's part of this excluded event, wear and tear, it's not covered. It's just not true. I've had attorneys who don't do this very often, who happen to get involved for one reason or another for a carrier, try to argue that first language, and they, for lack of a better term, look like fools, because we show them this and say, look, there's no way to read these 2 things in conjunction and make it work. So as a result, the main factor that matters is the ensuing loss coverage. Carriers have tried to clarify this. Farmers, again, they've changed their policy. I think it's been 3 policy changes in the past 7 years, give or take. And as a result, they've tried to make clarifications to this, but even those clarifications don't end up working. I'm not going to read this whole thing. It's too long to just read to you, and I want to make sure we get through everything. But this is their concurrent causation language. It is all jumbled together, but what they have right over here is this language. If any uninsured type of loss or damage does occur in combination with or in sequence to insured loss or damage, the uninsured type of loss or damage is not covered. So, in other words, the only thing that is excluded under the farmer's policy is the uncovered portion. So, yes, they've got this anti-concurrent causation language, but this hidden caveat within that gives you coverage for anything that would otherwise be covered. You don't know this unless you are reading through the policy language and reading it kind of carefully. You'll miss, because all you're going to see if you read this otherwise is uninsured types of losses or damage and this paragraph. And you think, oh, this is the anti-concurrent causation language. I don't have coverage for it. but the hidden language here makes the difference. There's a few carriers out there that have really unique language, things that I argue all the time as to what insurance is meant to say. Some of them actually say it. I was surprised when I found this next one from Selective. So I want to ask the group as a whole, if you have a loss where there's a really bad storm in an area, property is right in front of a storm drain, the storm drain outside of the property in the street gets inundated, can't handle all the water, and that storm drain overflows, and ultimately the water goes over the street, over the ground, over the front lawn, and into the client's property. Now, who in this group would actually take that claim? My guess is not many of you, because you're going to think the same thing I thought. Well, look, you're going to have a lot of issues here. You've got the backup or overflow of a sewer or drain, and if that isn't an endorsement, you've got trouble. You've got ground or surface water as a potential exclusion because it's coming outside the premises from a rainstorm coming in over the surface of the ground. That could be a problem. Well, by reading the policy closely, we found this provision. Unless the loss is otherwise excluded, we covered loss to property covered under coverage A or B resulting from an accidental discharge or overflow of water or steam from within a storm drain. So we cover an overflow of water from a storm drain. That is a great find within a policy. And what we've argued, and this was actually very similar to the class action we had against Travelers. For those who don't know, we had a class action with Travelers over the rot endorsement. They had $5,000 for hidden rot. Travelers tried to come through and say, well, hold on a second. The rot is the result of long-term water over a period of weeks, months, or years. Thus, it is excluded. And we said, hold on, Travelers. That can't possibly be true because you're giving them specific coverage for rot. The rot would be phantom coverage, right? You could never get it. Similar argument here. The storm drain, while it really almost unquestionably becomes surface water as it goes over the surface of the ground, you could never have a storm drain off of the property. By the way, it says off the residence premises. You could never have a storm drain overflow and not be ground or surface water. It's just not possible. So by adding this in, they've now said, okay, we're giving you coverage for this. We can't rely on the surface water, groundwater exclusion. So that became a covered loss. Now, this was a big deal for the homeowner because this is a huge, huge difference in getting nothing for their claim. And it was ultimately a large water loss from one of the recent storms up in Pennsylvania. So this is the kind of hidden gem you can find when you actually read through the full policy. Here's another great one from Allstate. I've mentioned this one in a few other webinars. So if you already knew this one, awesome. I hope it's working for you out in the field. Allstate is not allowed to pay a repair cost. I'll stress that again. For an item in a home that is damaged, they cannot pay a repair cost. They are only able to pay a replacement cost. So let's use a real world example. And by the way, this is the provision why. You can read it while I talk just so we get through all of these. The Allstate has a leak on a hardwood floor. Some of the hardwood floor is damaged, no question, and as a result, the floor has to be sanded and refinished to have the like kind and quality appearance. Allstate recognizes that, and they want to pay to sand and refinish. Well, you go to them and say, well, Allstate, hold on a second. That's fine, you want to sand and refinish, but you have to do it. You have to be the ones to actually do the work, Allstate. If you're not doing the work, which, by the way, they're pretty much never going to do because they don't want the liability or the trouble if it doesn't come out right. So they want to try to pay to sand or refinish that property, but they're not allowed to because either they do the repair, rebuild, or replace because it says we have the option to repair, rebuild, or replace, and they do. They can repair it if they want. They can rebuild it if they want. They can replace it if they want. Or they pay for all or any part of the damaged, destroyed, or stolen property as described in Condition 5, how we pay for a loss. That means if they recognize that hardwood floor is damaged and that hardwood floor needs to be fixed in its entirety, the only fix that they are allowed to pay for is for the replacement. All right. Hopefully you guys are doing that. It makes a big difference. Here is another big pet peeve of mine. This one comes up often when I have adjusters come and testify for cases. Because one of the questions I always ask adjusters is, hey, can you just explain to the jury or the judge or the panel, how does this policy work? What's covered, what's not covered? And almost every adjuster comes in and they say, oh, the policy covers for sudden and accidental direct physical loss to the property unless it's excluded. And they want to say that on nearly every policy out there. Well, the truth is that sudden and accidental language doesn't exist in most insurance policies. In fact, the large majority of the major carriers don't use the word sudden. That comes from Allstate. And I think what happened is adjusters became so accustomed to dealing with Allstate problems because of, it's Allstate, that they became accustomed to the sudden and accidental language. But other carriers don't have that. State Farm just has accidental direct physical loss. Selective, this one's really unique. And if you ever want some really deep dives into intellectual debates, risk of direct physical loss to property, right? So there's a lot of arguments and literature out there about, well, what is it to just be a risk of direct physical loss, rather actual direct physical loss? And Farmers says accidental direct physical loss or damage. Well, that's unique because, well, what's the difference between direct physical loss and damage? Right? Where's the distinction made there? So all of this coverage language can play differently within a policy and within a specific type of loss, and most of them you can use to your advantage. In other words, you don't need a loss for State Farm to be sudden. Sudden's not a prerequisite. State Farm likes to try to argue that it is, that you need a one-time event. That doesn't exist in the policy. Nowhere in the policy does it use the term sudden or one time or anything like it. And in fact, most policies don't. They try to use that language because it's just ingrained in so many people that losses need to have that sudden component to be covered. That's not true. It just needs to be direct physical loss, not otherwise excluded. If they can't fit it into an exclusion, even if it's not sudden, you've still got coverage. So make sure you're looking for that. As always, I always have a plug for adjusters associations. I put MAPIA up because I'm part of MAPIA, and we do CE credits as part of it for members. And we're actually working on a really super secret project right now that hopefully we're going to be ready to announce at the next Lunch and Learn. It will be, I think, a really, really fantastic opportunity for adjusters everywhere. But regardless of MAPIA or any other, I really suggest joining an association, whether it be MAPIA or APIA, which is the American Association of Public Insurance Adjusters, or whatever your local association may be. The associations are great because they fund a lot of important things, most importantly, lobbyists. So MAPIA has a lobbyist that they work with, and they work to make sure that we have someone in government that can contest the issues being brought to the table by carriers. So it protects the industry as a whole just by contributing to a group for what I consider a small yearly fee. I think it's like $300 for the entire year. I mean, you can write it off as a tax credit, and it more than pays for itself when you join a group like that. Books to read. I've been trying to do this for everyone. This was the easiest one. I've got more books in my office than I can count at this point when it comes to interpreting an insurance policy. But these three should absolutely be included in any library, any books that you ever read. The easiest read by far is When Words Collide. I've mentioned it before in a number of talks. It is absolutely fantastic. I've read it multiple times. Bill Wilson, I've asked him a number of questions. He's very responsive, a great guy. Absolutely should be reading that one. This one is much more comprehensive, as is How to Draft and Interpret Insurance Policies. These are written more like textbooks, but they are unbelievably valuable resource guides for understanding policies. The Homeowners Coverage Guide and How to Interpret Insurance Policies, half of them are all about property coverage, section 1. The second half is all about liability coverage. You don't really worry so much about that, but really, really, really great resources to have as part of your library. We're going to get into some of the questions that came in because there were some really good ones, and I think I'm going to get through in time. But I really want you guys to ask if you guys have anything out there, any additional questions that have come in other than what's already been sent to Mario. Please let us know. I know we've got viewers on Facebook, YouTube, and on our website. So please, wherever you are, put the comments or questions in the chat. We will be happy to get to them. So, do you have any tips and tricks to finding additional coverage? This one was the easiest to answer, and it's been the running theme of the entire talk. Read the policy. There is no major trick beyond that, other than attending webinars like this, where you can learn additional information on one-off type things. But this is the trick. I don't know how many ways to say it. Reading the policy is key. What are the options for an insured to file for an extension of benefits, and how do you go about doing that? So this one I took specifically because I wanted to talk about extensions for the adjustment of the claim. When you need an extension of time to continue the adjustment of a loss, that's perfectly fine. Adjusters do it all the time, and a lot of the time it's because of the carrier's own delays that cause it to happen. You should be sending a letter to the carrier. It's got to be in writing, requesting additional time, and there should be a reason tied to why you need additional time. It shouldn't just say, "Hey, can I have an additional 30 days to extend the suit limitation provision?" So when you're going through, you put your reason in there, and if you can tie it to, "Hey, you just did the inspection, we don't have an answer yet. We're still contesting X, Y, and Z issues." Whatever the case may be, put it into the letter. The reason it's so important, carriers don't have to grant it, right? There's nothing that forces a carrier to say, "Hey, I've asked for an extension, you have to give it to me." But the truth is, if they don't give it to you, I've got grounds just from that alone to potentially, not automatically, but potentially have a bad faith case. And the reason being is one of the issues of bad faith is in essence forcing an insured to file suit to get benefits covered under a policy. So if you've given the carrier a written opportunity to extend the suit limitation provision and they don't do it or they refuse, then you've now got an argument to say, "Well, you forced me to file suit. I literally had no other option because you didn't give it to me." The other nice language that you should use in these letters is a line that I tell adjusters to use all the time. Something along the lines of, "If I don't hear back from you within 10 days, I'll assume your acceptance of the extension." It puts a time limit on them to respond. And if they do what a lot of carriers do and do nothing, then you've got an implicit agreement to extend the suit limitation. I wouldn't necessarily hang my hat on that, and I would highly recommend speaking to an attorney before the suit limitation provision expires, before you kind of just agree to that, but it's a nice out if you need it. What are the keys to the settlement provisions of a policy? So as most of you probably know, there is a how we pay for a loss section under the policy. There's also a section regarding what you must do in the event of a loss. First and foremost, read the sections, right? It's pretty crystal clear. And reading the sections is important because if you've got a loss where they want to say, take an EUO of the son that was living at the property, or they want to take an EUO of the adjuster, it's always possible they ask for it. Most policies only give them the right to take an EUO of a named insured. So they're not going to have an opportunity to take it of other third parties. And even if they are third parties, your only responsibility is to attempt to assist them. If that third party doesn't show, it's not on you, right? So if they want to try and talk to the contractor, there's nothing you can do to force it to happen. So if the contractor doesn't talk to them, too bad. They can't exclude a claim. They can never deny a claim because a third party isn't communicating with them. That's never going to be a reasonable basis to deny a claim. So otherwise, you're going to want to look at the settlement provisions to figure out exactly how they should be paying the loss, ACV, RCV, deductibles. All of that is going to be spelled out. And if you've got specific questions on it, please give me a call. As with all of these, if you've got questions about a policy or a claim and just want to talk it out, it doesn't cost anything. I'm happy to take the phone call and talk to you about it. How do you dispute exclusions from wear and tear? Well, hopefully you've gathered that from the ensuing loss provisions, but that's how you do it. Wear and tear is only excluded for the item that is worn and torn that doesn't have any other cause of loss to it. The truth is, the second a home is built, it begins to wear down, right? It could be 3 weeks old, and I can nearly guarantee I could walk through a home and find something that is worn and torn in that property. It also starts to depreciate immediately. So depreciation is pretty much tied directly to the normal wear and tear of a home. This wall behind me has nicks and dings, and the ceiling's not perfect. I mean, there's problems everywhere. But if the place burns down, we've got coverage for it. Just the exact same thing happens for the home. So just because items have wear and tear doesn't mean it's excluded. This is probably most common with roofs. right? You've got a roof that's 25 years old and a hailstorm comes by. Well, this is the roof that the carrier insured, right? You were taking premiums to cover this roof. Correct. Number two, if this house were to burn down with the worn and torn roof, you pay for a new roof, right? Sure. Great. Roof that's 25 years old can still be damaged by hail, right? Well, sure, yeah. Okay. So now we've got, doesn't matter if it's worn and torn, it's still covered under the policy. It can still be damaged by wear and tear, or I'm sorry, still be damaged by hail. If you can point out that hail damage to them, doesn't matter how old the roof is, it's still covered. That's what they're paying for. All right, how do I get a copy of a State Farm policy when the agent says they can't get it and there's only a sample online? So there's a few options you've got. First and foremost, you can at least search the forms online and get that sample. The sample, if it's got the same form number on the bottom that we talked about earlier, is going to be the correct language that you need to enforce the policy. So check the deck page, see what the form numbers are, confirm that those form numbers match with the sample, and that's good enough. You don't need anything more than that because that is the policy, as long as the form numbers match up. If they don't have all the forms on there, you can search online. Do the search for the form numbers that we talked about earlier and get it that way. Finally, as I've mentioned a few times in the past, you can report it to the insurance department. And let me talk about that because I think it gets into the next question. Oh no, I'm one question back. So I'll finish it here and then you'll see the statute. They are required to give you the policy. If they don't, they are in violation of almost every Unfair Trade Practice Act that I have seen, and you can report that to the State Department, whether it be the Insurance Department, Department of Banking and Insurance, whatever it's called for your state, and get them to force it. We'll talk about the statute in a moment. What are you seeing adjusters miss when handling a puffback claim? Now, as I've always said, if you guys have questions, even if they are not related to the topic, I will do my best to address them. This was one of those questions. The number one thing I see people missing in puffback claims is a proper contents evaluation. Smoke damage and puffback damage to a property gets everywhere. It's no different than a fire claim next door. It's going to get on all the contents. It's going to get on every book on the wall. It's going to get on every knickknack. And those things need to either be cleaned or replaced. It's important to know a few things. When you've got smoke claims, smoke is corrosive. And it's corrosive to specific metals that are found in electrical wiring. So if the puffback gets onto things like televisions, and your television has vents in the top, just like this one does, right behind me, and gets in there, I've argued and almost always been successful that this TV needs to be replaced. And you know why I'm successful? It was rhetorical. I know you can't respond to me. It's because if they don't cover the TV and say they want to clean it, I send a letter to the carrier that says, I appreciate that you only want to clean the TV. We're willing to accept that so long as the carrier accepts liability for any future damage that might be the result of the smoke damage on the interior of the television. They will almost always say, no, I'm not going to take responsibility for that. And they can't really have it both ways. They can't say that, oh, sure, there might be other problems. We're not going to be responsible. And yes, we're only going to clean the property. It doesn't work. So using that and pointing out that, look, the corrosiveness can cause fires. We're concerned about it in the future. But if you accept liability, clean away. You'll often get the electronics replaced in a property when that happens. Is it mandatory to supply a full policy in a first party upon request? The answer is yes, and here is why. This is an example from the Pennsylvania Unfair Claims Practices Act, and it says an insurer or agent may not fail to fully disclose to first-party claimants pertinent benefits, coverages, or other provisions of an insurance policy or insurance contract under which a claim is presented. In other words, they have to give you the policy. You should have this language for whatever state you are working for as part of your standard bank of information to put into letters. Because every time you send a notice of loss to a carrier or a letter of representation, it should include this language with your request for the policy. Every single time. If this is not in your form letter, you are making a mistake. Because you are putting the carrier on notice from the very first contact you have that you want the policy, And here's why they have to give it to you. They cannot get away with not sending it. This is extremely valuable. Use it to your advantage as often as you need to. The Unfair Claims Practice Act is underutilized by most adjusters. They haven't read it, they know it exists, but they don't know what is in there. If you actually have a chance to read it, I suggest this weekend you open up the webpage and do a search for it and do a reading. If you can't find it, email me, I will send you a copy. I don't care where you are, I can find it, I assure you. So take a look at that and see what you can do. If you have questions about this, if you're having issues, notifying them of this provision when you make the request and them not sending it, this is what you use to prove to the insurance department that they're in violation, right? You send a complaint into the insurance department saying, hey, I requested it. I told them they had to do it based off of this provision, and they have ignored me. That is as much as you need for them to step in. And I can nearly guarantee, at a bare minimum, the carrier in their response to the insurance department will include a copy of the policy for you and ultimately make the issue moot, but you'll get a copy of your policy. All right. Taking a look at the next one here. Oh, another one of the slides. Mario's back there typing furiously for the questions. So, how to handle a contractor practicing UPPA and when they whisper in the client's ear to use them and not a PA. This question also comes up a lot, and there are some contractors out there who try to do this. There is a fine line between the unauthorized practice of public adjusting and just being a contractor. And that fine line has never been really well defined, in my opinion, by the courts, and it creates a lot of animosity between the two industries. The truth is, the two industries between public adjusters and contractors can work in tandem to maximize the claim value for the insured and get all the benefits that are owed under the policy. There have been more and more disputes between contractors publicly and public adjusters, and that kind of online fight that has been going on that I just don't understand to my core. There's enough business for everybody to go around, right? Insurance companies are not anytime soon going to start just paying every claim the way they should. So there's plenty for everybody. Contractors write estimates for losses. They do inspections for claims. They can even show damage to carriers. Contractors cannot do policy interpretation. They cannot be negotiating policy coverages. You can't do those things because you need a license as a public adjuster to do that. If you have a problem with someone that you believe is practicing as a public adjuster without a license, report it to the department. And they may or may not take steps, but that's about the best you can do. There's no further steps that can be taken. But really the better question to be asking is, hey, can I work with a contractor or any of these guys or women out there to really benefit everybody and most importantly in the insured so that they're maximizing claim value, right? You don't want a roofer going in and only worrying about a roof claim, but ignoring the water damage on the inside. And as a result, the insured loses their right because they miss limitation provisions or who knows what when it comes to reporting a claim. There is a way to do it in tandem. I've seen a lot of public adjusters who can work with contractors in a beneficial way for everybody involved. That should be the goal. If you have a foundation that was not damaged by the loss, but it is not in a condition that the structure should be rebuilt on, should this be covered under the regular policy dwelling A coverage or under O&L? First and foremost, if you've got L&I or license inspection or any code issue with it, you can get the coverage under O&L, and it really shouldn't be an issue as long as you've got the code to back it up. Whether or not it's covered under coverage A dwelling is a long-going battle. This is the less common situation. The number one that comes up is sheathing on a roof. All right, but the theory is exactly the same. You have a roof that's damaged by a storm. You pull the shingles off because they have to be replaced, and you find some sheathing that has been beat up for years and needs to be replaced. Whether or not that is covered. The argument that seems to win the day, although it hasn't really been tested in what I've seen in the case law, is that the carrier has to pay for whatever is necessary to make the repair for the covered damage. In other words, if you can't put a new shingles on that roof without doing the sheathing, then the sheathing has to be covered under the loss. It is still part of the same claim, same source of damage, same source of repair, and you've got the coverage. The argument should be the same for the foundation. The problem you're going to get into, of course, on this is, well, all of a sudden the foundation repair is far more expensive, and they're going to give a little bit more pushback. But this is going to be a case-by-case situation when it comes to really how to argue it based off of the policy. And if you ever hit a hurdle on this, please let me know, and I'll be happy to work with you on that. What's your take on the Liberty Safeco 14-day water exclusion? So most carriers out there have some version of this, right? Whether it be 14 days or weeks, months, or years, they've got an exclusion within the policy. What we have gotten and what we've been successful on, and how I argue this every time, carriers almost always will agree that damage that occurs in the first 13 days is covered, right? So you got a leak that's been going on for a month. That leak has been coming down from the shower in the second floor into the first floor, into the wall cavity, and you don't find it until it comes underneath the cabinets and escapes under your sink, and you realize it's actually coming all the way from upstairs. Well, it's been a month. What's covered? Your job as the adjuster is to put together a report based off of your expertise and experience as to what occurred in the first 13 days. And that is all that you present when it comes to the claim. When you put the notification into the carrier, you say, I'm making a claim for water damage that occurred within 13 days of the leak, and you stick to that. And it would become their burden to prove that the damage you're claiming occurred on day 14, 15, 16, and so on. If this wall gets wet from a loss and leaks for 5 days, it's covered, right? No question about it. And that damage is covered. Well, let's say the leak stops. I fix it, and all of a sudden something else happens. Another leak comes down on the same wall 3 months later. I haven't yet repaired the wall itself, and a new leak happens, and that leak was going on for a month. It doesn't change that that first loss was covered, right? It's not like the carrier is going to come back and say, oh, now you had another leak. That first leak from those 5 days, 3 months ago, not covered now. The fact that it just doesn't stop, that you get that first 13 days and it keeps going, doesn't change that the first 13 days are covered. I hope that makes sense. I've actually got Allstate to admit that on the record. They've confirmed that the first 13 days are covered, and other carriers will have to be following suit because there's just no basis for an exclusion within the policy for that. The big goal here, though, is you have to be confident in your distinction between what happened on the first 13 days and what might have happened after the first 13 days. That's what you need to do to get these claims covered. Some policies don't clearly define if policy is ACV or RCV. Where will you find this? So this is almost always going to be in the how we settle a loss provision of a policy. And it can be deceiving. I just finished a trial on this where the deck page said that this is a replacement cost policy, and then later on in the policy it changed to ACV and then actually paid when incurred. But it got complicated, and it was certainly deceptive for the carrier to do that. If you go to the how we settle a loss, that will outline how they do their payments. And it changes for different carriers. Some say that if it's $2,500 or less, it's automatically RCV. We're not taking any depreciation. Over $2,500, we take our ACV, and you get your depreciation when you make the repairs. So those issues can come up, and you can find those answers throughout the policy that way. If you ever can't find it and you need me to take a look, again, give me a call. I will be happy to discuss it with you and show you in the policy where that language is. Farmers has been recently denying roof claims for wind damage for mechanical breakdown. They're saying that the glue on the tabs has broken, and not resetting is breakdown. Thoughts? Great question. First, mechanical breakdown is not a defined term in almost every policy I've ever seen. As a result, using mechanical damage or mechanical breakdown as a cause of loss, can be difficult for a lot of carriers because they can't define what mechanical breakdown is. The reason being is if you generally, as a layperson, hear mechanical breakdown, most people think of machinery, right? That it's some type of, my air conditioner unit stops working because of X, Y, and Z reason. That's a mechanical breakdown. Mechanical breakdown to a 3-tap shingle conceptually becomes much more harder and is certainly, at a bare minimum, in my opinion, ambiguous. So first and foremost, I don't like them denying it for mechanical breakdown in the first place. Secondly, the fact that it isn't resealing when you've got a loss doesn't matter that it's a mechanical breakdown, because in most of the policies, farmers included, the fact that it was lifted by wind in the first place gets you that coverage, right? So that the shingle itself was lifted and that seal was broken as a result of the wind. That gets you coverage for that shingle and that seal. The fact that it didn't reseal doesn't matter, because as we looked at, that ensuing loss language contained within the anti-concurrent causation doesn't give them enough basis to fully deny the shingle, because you're able to distinguish what was damaged by the wind, the breaking of the seal, versus the fact that it simply didn't reseal when it came down. So it doesn't matter to me whether or not they want to call it mechanical breakdown in the end, because it's still covered. But if you need to have the fight them over what mechanical breakdown actually means and what the cause of the broken seal in the first place was, and you should be able to have some success. That's certainly a claim worth fighting. If they don't shift on that one, I'd be happy to push them on that issue in litigation. Oop, back on. Oh, there we go. How about underwriting files? Are you aware of any statute/case law that requires the disclosure of underwriting files from carriers? Good news, yes. Bad news, not for you. There is nothing you can do to force the carrier to release their underwriting files to you as the adjuster, or even to the homeowner. There's no law or statute that requires it to be disclosed. There all are laws and statutes pre-litigation required to be disclosed to the insurance department, but that doesn't help you in any way. However, if the claim needs to go to litigation, I can get it. And we've been pushing and gotten way better over the past couple of years at not only getting underwriting files, but getting their claim guides and actually seeing, what are they telling adjusters they need to be doing in the field, getting their instruction manuals for what they're first given when they're brought onto a company. I mean, the amount of paperwork and the amount of material that these companies have through internal systems is really incredible. We've deposed a number of corporate representatives on these issues. I've gotten them from a number of carriers. So we have a lot of information. Now, a lot of that it becomes confidential when they send it over. So it's not like I can use it against them in practice. I can't go publishing them online. But the truth is that when a case comes in, now that I have this knowledge, I know what to ask for. I know what actually exists, and the carriers get a lot more afraid to have to fight on these cases because they know the type of information that I've already got. So we can get the underwriting files, we can get all of this stuff. It just, unfortunately, can't be something that we get on your end without having to actually file suit. All right. I appreciate the questions. Keep them coming. Comments on the Texas case where the roofer challenged the UPPA, claimed 14th Amendment due process protection, Stonewater Roofing versus Department of Insurance. That must have been one of the ones that Mario was really typing feverishly in the background. I haven't read the case when it came through. I heard about it happening, but I haven't fully read it, so I'm in a tough spot to fully comment on it. So why don't I do this? Why don't I take a look at the case? Whoever wrote the comment will have it. I'll be happy to get back to you on it. Unfortunately, just not in a position to comment on it without reviewing it more closely. All right. Thoughts on OSHA compliance costs being excluded by carriers under O&L increased cost exclusion, which generally deals with increased costs for betterments of materials newly required by new O&L. OSHA compliance issues are not O&L. They are part of the necessary repair process. So, when it comes to safety harnesses on roofing and that type of material, they can't come through and say that that's not covered under O&L because it's not ordinance and law to the repair itself. It's required as to what you need to do to make this repair, right, to cover this loss. So I would have a very hard time with a carrier trying to stand by this as a basis for an exclusion or a reason not to pay a claim. It just doesn't make any common sense to me. Not something I've admittedly had to fight before, but certainly one I would be up for fighting if this is an issue. Truly, I haven't heard of a lot of adjusters complaining of not paying for OSHA stuff because of O&L, but if it's coming up, I'll be happy to fight that fight. All right. Unless there's any other questions that come popping in, I thank you guys so much. Please take down a lot of you probably, if this is your first time, don't have my cell phone number. This is my direct line. It is always going to be the best way to reach me, and feel free to bug me. For example, I was just in trial. I finished yesterday. I missed a heck of a lot of calls, but adjusters, they recognize they can shoot me a text message and say, Tony, still haven't heard back. Can you give me a call? I never mind that at all. So please bug me as often as you need. If you need me to review any documents, there's my email address. I'm always happy to do that as well. Thank you all so very much. I know I went a little bit longer on this one, but it's just a ton of information. If you've got any other questions or need anything in the future, please let me know. I'm happy to help. Thanks so much.